want to just quickly introduce my panelists here. Peter Kirchschläger, Director of the Institute of Social Ethics at the University of Lucerne, and Nicklas Lundblad, the Director of Public Policy at Google DeepMind. Thank you both. All right, we're going to make a slight shift from people to machines, but they are related. And given that you are a philosopher and professor of ethics, I thought I would start with a big philosophical question, which is if AI stands for artificial intelligence, then presumably we, human beings, are the intelligence. And my question is, if humans are the fodder for AI, do we, just by being here, consent to being the sort of the material that is mined? Are we able to opt out, or is it just by being here we're all the material for artificial intelligence?
Well, thank you so much, Pamela, for this question, and all thanks for having me to the Athens Democracy Forum. I think the crucial point is exactly that there isn't so much choice about that, and from an ethical point of view, there should be choice. So I don't know how many of you have been ever asked if you want to be the material and providing data on which then so-called artificial intelligence is developed, trained. I have never been asked for that, and I think that's a crucial problem. One of the main ethical negative aspects of so-called AI is, in fact, that our data is stolen, that copyrights are violated, that privacy is violated, that the ecological impact of so-called AI is not taken into account enough so far. So there are many issues we see now from an ethical perspective, and I just want to emphasize that with one concrete example that we have a lot of homework still to do. In 2024, you can put an app, and I'm sorry for that terrible example, but you can put an app which is sexualizing pictures of children on the market, and the only thing which has happened to you as a company registered in the United States of America is that you gain a lot of economic profit. In 2024, if I park my bicycle at a train station in Lucerne, at the center of Switzerland, in an incorrect way, I get immediately a fine. As an ethicist, I don't have so many counter-arguments against that because there are traffic laws, of course. But still, can you imagine you can produce an app sexualizing pictures of children, put that on the market, and nothing is happening? So what I'm trying to say here is that we have to identify precisely the ethical positive potential and try to foster that and try to enhance that. But we have also to identify very precisely the ethical risks, the ethical problems, and address them firmly and with urgency. And one way I would argue to tackle that is with so-called human rights-based AI, so that we organize the entire life cycle of AI in a way that is respecting rights of the child, that is respecting human rights. So I'm going back to excavation of natural resources happening nowadays with human rights violations, with destroying the planet, and the production of these technologies, again, happening with human rights violations, with destroying the planet, and the use of it. Again, we need to focus on making that happening in a human rights conformative way. And last but not least, I think it's crucial that we also establish an institution who is taking care then of the enforcement, of the implementation of human rights-based AI, because this will not happen automatically. We need someone who is taking care on a global level at the UN, making this happen. If you look at the business models we have right now in place, human rights violations are not a collateral side effect which is not envisioned. It's at the core of these business models where human rights violations are occurring, and therefore I would argue for an establishment of an international database systems agency, IDA at the UN, taking care of the implementation of human rights-based database systems by first making sure that there is an access to market approval process, So for example, an app sexualizing pictures of children wouldn't even end up on the market. A company wouldn't even have the idea to produce something terrible like this, because the company would know that it wouldn't pass the access to market approval process, something we have in all other industries. I mean, look at the pharmaceutical industry coming from Switzerland. Roche, Novartis never argue against, the access to market approval process. They accept the idea that they will, like the medication, the pharmaceuticals are first tested if people they would kill people or not, if they would destroy the environment or not. And that's totally accepted. Why don't we have something like that in the area of so-called AI? So it's access to market approval process. Second, it would be about making sure that human rights violations with or by so-called AI are monitored and sanctioned. And third, fostering global collaboration on it from a technical point of view. Because we all know that we can progress faster and better in order to foster the ethical opportunities of so-called AI if we don't have just access to the data of Athens, but if we have access to global data.
Well, thank you. I think you're quite right. We are living in a time of evolving regulatory frameworks right now for AI. So if you think about what's happening with the European AI Act, with the executive order in the US, with all of the work that's been going into the code of practice, and you also think about the sort of support that the industry has had for the development of the AI safety institutes in both the UK and US, and they are now meeting in November to figure out if there's a global structure that can be had here. I think we are quickly moving towards a regulated state of artificial intelligence, and nobody is actually against that. The question of ownership of data is at the heart of that, and we have to figure that out. The way we've done that historically, and we've always sort of been through these things when new technologies come, is that we've looked at legislation, and sometimes legislation has changed. We've looked at licensing. There's a lot of commercial deals being struck around data now, sort of referred. And then, of course, at litigation. There's tons of litigation where we're sorting this out in the courts as you're supposed to do in democracy. I mean, I think the New York Times has involved in a fair bit of litigation, to be honest.
That was my little smile.
Yes. And so there's all of these things, right, where you're claiming your rights, where courts are looking at this, where there's regulatory frameworks, where there's institutional build-out, and that is exactly what it should be. And I think that's a very healthy thing. And you won't see, of course, corporate industry is going to have its view. It is looking at things from a corporate perspective. That's not weird. That's the way things have always been. And then others are going to have their perspective, and that is how we should sort of negotiate out these different things. My other point, though, is that when we talk about this kind of data, we talk about a very, it's a large piece of the chatbots that you're seeing today. But if you think about the 30-year perspective on artificial intelligence and where the value will actually be, the value from artificial intelligence, when we write the history in 30 years from now, will have been from how it accelerates science. And that kind of data, it's data on maritime environments, it's data on climate change, data on proteins, data on how we can do better drug discovery. That is something that we have to produce and use as a natural resource that we can all contribute to. That's why, for example, in the science space, and this is where the real welfare impact will be, this is where sort of the upside of artificial intelligence is. We are creating data sets together, we're creating models together, we're releasing them as open source, trying to get to a point where we can reignite the scientific project, because that's at the heart not just of sort of finding the truth, which is what we're sort of here to talk about, but also at the heart of democracy. Democracy depends on progress, and progress depends on science. And science, that data, that is actually much less controversial than the data that Peter speaks about.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you on your last point that I would also expect, from an ethical point of view, a huge positive potential in, progress in science, in research, and that's really something which is fantastic about the tool, so-called AI. I'm not so sure if I agree with you in this kind of description of paradise. It's all set. We negotiate everything about AI and everything is fine.
It's not
it's a natural
paradise.
problem. We have seen like the last 25, 30 years, industry, and I'm not naming now companies, single them out, but the industry, I mean, representatives of the industry explicitly saying to nation states, listen, we don't respect your laws, we don't care about them until your fees on the violations of the laws are lower than the economic benefit we are getting out of it. So we are dealing with a new kind of understanding what the rule of law is, and that's dramatic. I mean, it's telling something if an ethicist is giving compliments to companies who are violating the law without making it public and making it even a public position. And that was, of course, not all companies, but some companies did that in the past. And it's telling you something that I say, well, that was even better than the ones we have coming now from the few multinational big tech companies who are basically really saying, not basically, explicitly saying to nation states, listen, we don't respect your laws anymore because your fees are lower than the economic profits we gain. So there needs to be a reaction by nation states. There needs to be a firm reaction by the international community. And I think what we see in the field of so-called AI is of that dramatic impact on a positive but also on the negative side, that we have to think it similar to nuclear technologies. In the case of nuclear technologies, we have built the International Atomic Energy Agency as a reaction to the several uses of atomic bombs. It's not a perfect institution, but at least it was able to avoid the worst. Of course, it will be used for geopolitical interests in front of all superpowers, but still we have to admit it was able to avoid the worst. So I think we need something like that, and that was the idea behind IDA, similarly built now in the case of AI, because AI is just too impactful that we just can watch what the industry does. Because, as you said, corporate interest is not common good. Corporate interest is, fortunately enough, it is shareholder values first, and that's often in conflict with common goods.
Corporate interest will be a special interest, always. That's true whether you're the New York Times or if you're Google DeepMind, right? So that's always going to be the case to some extent. But I think that the reality here is that there's also other analogies that we can use. The nuclear power one we explored we have from the beginning, when we were founded, we hired a lot of ethicists and philosophers, and one of the things that we've been doing is exploring structures for international regulation, because we do believe that this is fundamentally different than the internet.
But I was,
I just want to, oh, sorry,
no,
I was interrupting, yeah.
I was interrupting you, sir.
No, I just want to say I think there's another analogy here. The nuclear power one is very attractive because it sort of brings your mind to destruction and extraordinary power. But I think the other one is that this is a general purpose technology. So what you may want to think about is how do we regulate things like electricity? How do we think about electricity generation? And how do we think about the international frameworks around energy? And that's a version of that.
I want to return to, we're going to get to regulation and also to some of the applications, but I want to stay, if we can, for another moment on these sort of basic philosophical underpinnings, because when you talk about the fact that artificial intelligence is based on humans and whether or not there's a kind of consent to that, you also have to ask who is not being represented in the creation of artificial intelligence, particularly when we're talking about democracy. Not everyone is online. Not everyone is feeding their information into these algorithms. Not everyone is participating in, whether they're in a democracy or an autocracy, and even in a capitalist system, not everyone is participating in the mechanisms that the information that artificial intelligence is based on. So how does AI account for the fact that you're really only building that intelligence based on a certain part of the population while leaving a huge number of people out?
I fully agree with you that, in fact, we have not only biases in the data, but we have also biases in the algorithms themselves, how they are built. They're not fair, they're not objective, they're not neutral. So they are biased, and that, of course, has a huge impact, discriminating people who are not part of that data or not part of the research team, developers team, actually producing these algorithms. And I think what is the even worse news then is that all of us, though, are manipulated by so-called AI or with so-called AI. So, be it as a consumer, buying products you never wanted to buy, but you're just triggered by AI because there's such amount of data about me, about you available, so you can really trigger the right spots, which then make the music play, basically, that you buy what you should buy. But also as citizens, we have several elections where it is proven, several votes, political decisions where it's proven that data was used to manipulate the citizens. So you are, on the one hand, you have the discrimination issue, but you have, on the other hand, this huge issue of manipulation, which gets even more drastic if you think about so-called generative AI, which allows you with deepfakes basically to destroy a politician within seconds with one click. Because even if the politician then says that this deepfake is not her or him, it still remains in our minds. We cannot get these moved pictures out of our head.
I think the bias problem is real. I think it's very hard to figure out exactly what to do, but we have to think about a way in which we cannot just document those groups that are outside of the data that we're using, because that easily becomes a kind of data imperialism, where you walk in and say, hey, we're going to make sure you're represented, and then you sort of collect data about people, and they don't have the choice, they don't consent.
There was that Google thing, right, where you had everyone, you would search for a Viking, and everyone was black because they tried to make it racially and ethnically representative, and then it...
Yeah, but what you have to do then is you have to provide the means to these communities to curate their own data. And that's going to be really hard and require a kind of institutional innovation that goes deep to the heart of how we think about data overall in our society. And that will go to, people might not want to be documented, and so they might exclude themselves from these different systems. It's a well-known problem in the science of artificial intelligence, and there's tons of research going into this. There is attempts to figure out if you can use so-called synthetic data, which is data that is not about anyone actually, but sort of made up simulated data in order to figure this out. That is hard. And then there's attempts to try to build institutions in these communities so they can own their own data and share it on their own conditions. And that is what we have to do. I don't think because the go-to answer easily becomes, yes, we should have data about everyone. And then the other go-to answer is we should not have any bias in our data sets, which is, of course, also wrong, because the way that we actually make sure that these data sets recognize bias is by showing them what bias looks like. The idea that you can have a clean, pure, sort of ultimately pristine data set and train on that, and you will have a good and rational and happy and sort of almost ideal AI is obviously wrong. And we shouldn't dodge the larger issue here. Bias didn't appear in data sets. It's not as if it sort of just came up in data sets. Bias is ingrained in our societies. And if we can see it, we can work with it. And what this has actually done is to make bias visible in a way that it hasn't been before.
If I may,
yes.
just short 2 points. I think first, I think your company, but also the other companies can do more about it.
Yeah.
Because the technical possibilities are there. I'm visiting professor at ETH Zurich. From a tech side, there are solutions to that. And secondly, and I think that's the even more important point, of course, I'm biased. I have my biases, but I think, and that you can say, well, then, so-called AI doesn't have a problem because it's biased as well, so we're both kind of bad in that. Yeah, but the important and essential difference between humans and machines is that we are able to self-critically examine our biases. So for example, if I try to recruit people for my team at my institute, I know that I'm biased, and I can work on that. I can bring in other people. I can try to, have that monitored some way, reviewed again and again and again to get that out. So-called AI isn't able to do that. And,
oh, it is.
But
you can self-review a data set.
Sure, but still with definite limits, because at the end of the day, so-called AI, it's not even irrelevant for it if it's biased or not.
Of course it is relevant because you want to make a good decision.
Yeah, but not for so-called AI itself. And I think that's an important difference we have to keep in mind when you're saying we should regulate so-called AI like we did with electricity. Well, please, you cannot compare so-called AI with electricity. There's a huge difference how powerful so-called AI is, even manipulating the way we are forming our opinions, how we are making decisions. Electricity doesn't have this impact.
What do you mean by so-called AI versus, I'm curious.
Well, I'm referring to so-called AI because I would not doubt that it is artificial, but I would doubt that it is intelligence for the following reasons. If you look at human intelligence, you have certain areas of human intelligence where so-called AI is already outperforming us by far, and that will explode not within years, but within months, due to the fact that we really can scale up computing power. So that is, for example, use of big data. Machines are surpassing us by far. Logical deduction, calculation, also something we have lost, and we will even lose further in the future. But then there are other areas of intelligence where I would doubt that AI will even reach that area of intelligence in the future. So I'm not just saying it's not able to do that in the present, but also in the future. So for example, emotional and social intelligence. Take a healthcare robot with a certain element of AI within it. I can teach that healthcare robot, please cry if the patient is crying. And the robot will cry beautifully, and everyone will be happy, so empathetic. But at the end of the day, it's not authentic. The healthcare robot just does what we have trained it to do. So I can train the exact same healthcare robot. Please, and excuse the example, please clap the patient in her face or his face if she or he is starting to cry. And the healthcare robot will also perform that action perfectly. So what I'm trying to say, emotions cannot be built by computing power. It's never going to be authentic. And there's another, just one sentence, there's another area of intelligence, moral capability. Moral capability means that we humans are able to identify ourselves what is ethically right and ethically wrong. And again, something which a healthcare robot or any so-called AI is not able to do. We need to train ethical rules, ethical principles to them.
I just want to interrupt for 1 second to build on something you both mentioned. So you've talked about science applications. You were talking just about healthcare implications or applications. One of the things we often hear with AI is its promise in terms of diagnostics, diagnosing cancer, being able to run models. And since I come from the land of litigation, the United States, I often think about what could go wrong and who would get sued, right? Because if you ever have a situation where you have a doctor make an error, you can sue for malpractice. But if you have artificial intelligence making an error that results in loss of life or harm of some kind, who then is responsible? How do you assign responsibility to artificial intelligence?
I think there's a couple of things we have to walk through here, and I want to pick up on something Peter said. And one of them is this: that we have this tendency to view artificial intelligence as an alternative to ourselves, like an external entity that we relate to in some way, and that could take our jobs or could do things in society, etc. And actually, the more we're working on this, the more we realize that what it actually does is work with us in different ways. And so the noun intelligence is very hard, and it sort of gives you this idea of a box somewhere that is intelligent. And that is, of course, not how intelligence works. Intelligence isn't even in our heads. Intelligence is in the practice, the community of practice that we work in. And what we do is we add capability to this. And we've always done that with technology. We did it with pens, we did it with pocket calculators. Now we're adding it at a very different scale with artificial intelligence. It's not a substitute, but a complement to human capacity. And humans should always be in the driver's seat. Because humans are better at the classical Greek virtues. We're better at the dialectic, asking questions and answering them. We're better at ethics because we have moral capability and culpability in a different way. And we're also better at rhetoric. We can communicate much, much better than the machines can. Even though deepfakes is a sort of a topic du jour, I think that we have the ability to communicate and sway and convince each other in a way that a machine cannot yet do. And I think those three things are always going to be human values. So we need to have human-centric artificial intelligence design. That's really, really important. Assigning liability then is something that we've always done in the same way in our societies. We looked at who actually had the best opportunity to prevent this harm. In some cases, that will be the provider of the data set. In some cases, that will be the designer of the artificial intelligence. In some cases, that will be the doctor. We will figure that out and try to figure out how we can do this. But in the end, we should also be quite open with the fact that if we get this right, we're going to have first-line medical attention paid to billions of people who have never had access to healthcare. And that's a huge difference to where we are yesterday. We sometimes debate artificial intelligence as if we sort of unnecessarily are introducing this technology into our world. Well, we should remember that we live in a world with really complex problems where we need new tools, and that is what it is, a tool to address those problems. And it can go for climate change, it can go for health, it can go for pandemics, it can go for different kinds of other problems that we have around us. And we need to make sure that we have the right tools. Artificial intelligence is a tool, it's a scientific instrument. That's the best way to think about it. It's not a chatbot, it's not a robot, it's not a substitute for humans. It's a scientific universal instrument that allows you to see into complexity, find the patterns in complexity that you can then work with. And that's what I hope for, the acceleration of science, because we need that. We're not in a stable situation. Our societies will not just sort of go on if we do not continue to have scientific progress.
So I would agree with you, Nicklas, that machines cannot be held responsible, cannot be held accountable, because they lack freedom, they lack autonomy, they lack moral capability. I would also agree with you that the research potential is huge in so-called AI. What I'm wondering, though, is if I look back at the last 25, 30 years, I've seen less from that side, but rather seen, manipulation all over the place. So I'm not so sure if we really should trust in continuing the way we have done so far. We have, in the area of so-called AI, but rather if there isn't a need for, and I would argue for it, for establishing, an international database systems agency, IDA, at the UN, in order to make sure that what you have been describing so beautifully is really occurring, and all the negative, potential we have unfortunately seen evolving in the last decades, we can get rid of that. Because I think there's an urgency to get rid of that. Think about the digital divide. I mean, we have still an exploding digital divide from a global perspective, and nothing is done about it. The only thing which is done about it is that there are attempts to even benefit out of this global digital divide, not trying to close it, but rather to get it exploded even further.
All right, we're going to talk about regulation in the last few minutes, because I can tell you're both dying to discuss it. But if you think about the internet, right, early on there was very little regulation. It was, information should be free. This is this new technology. Let's sort of stand back and see how it develops, right? That didn't quite work out as well as intended. Similarly with social media, very little regulation, particularly in the United States. You have a bit more here in Europe. And now we're seeing the repercussions of that in terms of disinformation, the exacerbation of political polarization, the mental health state of young people in particular. So now we have AI, right? It's our third chance, maybe our 100th chance in terms of new technologies to, from the beginning, come up with smart ways to regulate it. And we need to do it as soon as possible, because if anything, it's happening, it's developing much more quickly even than those earlier technologies. And yet in the United States, for example, you just had in the state of California an effort to regulate AI that was, that Governor Gavin Newsom, who is a real progressive on the left, nonetheless voted against it. But the technology industries did not want that regulation. And so I'm curious as to what you realistically think regulation can and should look like.
So I think that we have a lot of good regulation coming up. We have the European AI Act. I think that's a really interesting example. They're complementing that with a code of practice, and they're implementing it over the coming years in different kinds of AI offices around all of the European Union. And I've been talking to several different governments who are taking this very seriously. And I think it's worthwhile to go back to your example, because we have gotten, if you compare AI to the internet, the amount of regulation we've gotten in the last year represents around 10 to 15 years of regulation that we got for internet in its first years. And I think that's healthy. And I don't think that anyone in the industry will disagree with that, because I do think that this technology, in order to have public trust for it, requires a regulatory framework. In the US, you have had the executive order that sets out very strict federal rules. You have a challenge in getting things through Congress, it seems. But there has been a lot of stuff coming from the executive order that has been very helpful. And the establishment of two institutions, the UK AC, the US AC, and now similar institutes focused on safety and testing these systems, within a year after ChatGPT sort of was the breakthrough moment, is unparalleled in the history of technology regulation. We've never seen anything like this before. And that is a good thing. Do we need more? Of course we do, because the technology evolves. There are plenty of things we have to figure out. One of the things we have to figure out that we haven't understood yet is how to regulate artificial agency, for example. Artificial agency is essentially you delegating to your machines to do something for you.
So that it doesn't turn into HAL.
And we have sort of thought about that in legislation before. We have the parent-child relationship, the dog-owner-dog relationship, the employee-employer relationship. But we now might have to think through what that looks like in a machine world as well. And so my sense is that the regulatory approach that we have is a good beginning. And I'm not describing paradise, to be clear, because I think no one would say that we're done yet, because we're at the very cusp of this. And I think that other things that have to be done, positive things, are things like we have to reinvent, and this is going to sound nerdy, but we have to reinvent statistical agencies. Because we have to think about what parts of our society we want to make readable in order to make progress on all of the problems that we have. Statistical agencies were conceived originally in the 19th century for governing governments to understand what they were governing. And we now have the opportunity to gather much more data about the world to understand what we're governing and become better at it. And I think improvements in government can lead to improvements in democracy, can lead to improvements in the legitimacy and belief and trust in democracy as well. So there is a common, if we sort of go outside of the corporate perspective for a while, there's a common task for us as societies to think about what is it we want to learn? Because underneath the noun, intelligence, lies the verb learning. And that is what this technology allows you to do, learn. You can learn in bad ways about people in order to manipulate, as you say, but you can also learn in fantastic ways about the entire molecular biological universe so you can cure diseases. What do we want to learn? That's a really interesting question for the future of democracy.
Peter?
Well, I'm really happy to learn that you are now on the side of regulation. That wasn't the case a year ago at the UN panel where you're vice president of Google. I mean, if your mother company was publicly saying we don't need any regulation, I'm happy to hear that this position has changed.
We've always, if you go back and look at the record, we have said that we're in favor of regulation for 2 years.
I also listened to you the entire time. So, secondly, if that would have been the case, then I'm asking, then we have done something wrong, because the reality doesn't look like a beautifully regulated space to me. We have mental health issues, we have manipulation in the economic area, we have manipulation in the political area, we have social media concerns, as you were describing them very adequately. We have an exploding digital divide. We have representatives of multinational big tech companies in public saying, well, human rights, where the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in 1948, declared by the international community. There wasn't any internet, now there's the internet, therefore we don't need human rights anymore. So it doesn't sound to me really like this profound support of human rights-based regulation. I think we have to be clear, it needs the nation states, it needs the international community to regulate firmly this space. And in front of all, we just don't need just paper, but we need an institution making sure that this regulation is also enforced. I'm totally happy that we have, for example, now the European AI Act from the European Union. But we have also to be aware of the fact that the AI Act has chosen a risk-based approach, which is surprising. You would expect such an international treaty choose a rights-based approach. Why was this happening? Well, there's one reasoning going into one suspect going into the more than 20 million US dollars spent every year by your mother company, but other companies on lobbying, the European Union. Ending up with, you can say, well, risk-based sounds nice. Well, risk-based is extremely subjective. Something which is a risk to you doesn't seem to be a risk to me. While we would have had the possibility to create it in a rights-based way, where you have a violation of rights, you can precisely identify that. And in front of all, if you then give the risk assessment, so basically say, if this glass is high risk or not, to the company who is selling that glass, is probably not a good idea. I mean, that would be similar to the situation where I would organize an exam at my university and have my students grade their own exams. It would work at my university because my students are fantastic. But in the case where such high-scale economic interests are at stake, who will be the company who will develop a product, put it in the pipeline, and then go and say, listen, this is high risk, please stop me before I put it on the market? That's not so realistic, at least to my point of view. And what will really happening is that, companies will present one high-risk product where they already have lost any hope that this will end up on the market. And then because then they can say, well, we have played the game, we have participated in this beautiful high-risk assessment process, and then they will have the real product not declared. So I'm saying I'm happy with that there is regulation on AI on the European level, but we also have to be very precise identifying the flaws of it, and in front of all, we need to have regulation and institution taking care of it on a global level because it's a global phenomenon and we have to deal with global companies, obviously.
All right, we haven't solved everything, but Peter, Nicklas, thank you both so much.